Aloha, I'm State Representative Cindy Evans, and thank you for joining me today with my show, Now What? And I have a guest with me today that's come from Boulder, Colorado, and it's just a lot of fun to obviously meet people that are visitors to our state capitol, but also who brings a lot to the plate in helping us with our legislation, and we'll talk more about that as the show goes on. But I'd like to introduce to you Corina Eckl, who's the Fiscal Programs Director for National Conference of State Legislators. Hi, Corina.
Hi.
Hi, welcome today.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
All right. Well, I thought it'd be really interesting for people in Hawaii to understand that state legislators don't pass legislation and do all this work by ourselves. It's not like Cindy Evans comes up with all the great ideas and pushes forth all this legislation. In fact, we have many resources and people and organizations behind the scenes that really support us, and National Conference of State Legislators is one of those organizations. And I thought it'd be interesting for people to hear about it. So can you tell us a little bit about the organization?
I'm happy to. We are an organization that was founded in 1979, and we are located in Denver, Colorado. That's our headquarters. But we also have an office in Washington, D.C. And the D.C. office focuses on state-federal relations. And so we lobby Congress and the administration on issues that are important to the states, essentially around the 10th Amendment. The office in Denver focuses more on state-to-state relations and activities, and we serve predominantly as a clearinghouse for information. So for instance, when Hawaii is considering legislation in maybe a new area or a developing area, let's take, for example, distracted drivers and whether or not drivers can use cell phones while they're driving, we'll have someone from Hawaii, for instance, call us and say, well, gee, what are the other states doing on that? Who's passed legislation? What does the legislation look like? So we serve a clearinghouse function so that you're not starting from scratch and trying to figure out what some of this legislation could look like or has looked like in other states. So you're absolutely right. It's a team effort, and we serve as a resource to all 50 states and the U.S. Commonwealths and territories. So we make sure that we're trying to provide the best information we can for all of you so that whatever the political persuasion is of a state, we're providing good, neutral, objective information to help you make better decisions.
What struck me when I got an email about the services being offered is the video conferencing, the telephone conferencing, and how you will connect sometimes legislators from across the whole United States on a conference call even to talk about certain issues. Can you give us an example? And if I was a legislator and I'm really focusing and zeroing in on one topic, could I call you and say, can you connect me with other legislators and let's get this conference call going? Or how do you get that going?
Well, I have a really good example of that.
Okay.
This past fall, the Senate President from Vermont, Senator Peter Shumlin, called and said, hey, the revenue situation is changing pretty dramatically in Vermont. What's going on in other states? I'd really be interested in talking to legislative leaders in other states and fiscal chairs, people who are on the front line and dealing with some of these problems. So at his request, we send out an email to legislative leaders and to fiscal chairs. We have a database that has all that information in it. And we organized a conference call. He actually happily served as the convener and the moderator and sort of got everything going. And people from around the country participated and provided information and asked questions. And it was quite an interesting dialogue for at least an hour. So that was a conference call mechanism that we used for that. We've been doing a lot of that with the federal stimulus legislation. There are so many questions about that. So we've had every Thursday for about 8 weeks a conference call where we have enabled people to call in and say, hey, I don't understand the maintenance of effort provision, or when are these projects going to have to get off the ground? And we've, through the experts that we have in our own office in Washington, D.C., and as well as pulling in people from the Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office, we've convened these conference calls to get more information out to people, which is a time-saving, cost-saving way of sharing information. Instead of having to physically come together, they can actually get together electronically to have this kind of information sharing and really just a collaboration and some good networking.
And it's also real time, which means you can actually have, like we're having this conversation, you can actually have this across the United States with other states. I'm very excited about it. I was telling you before the show started that you know, as a legislator, this is my 7th year, but every year you learn a little bit better how to use the resources that are available to you. But if you don't know how to ask the question or how to plug in and ask for that assistance, it's like a resource you never use. So, you know, it's really a pleasure to meet you and also know that you're the fiscal program director, which is really what I think is the #1 issue across the whole United States. Can you comment more on that?
Yes, I can. And in fact, let me mention another technology that we have used recently to share information. Just this past Friday, we held a webinar, which is this combination of a conference call, but you also have PowerPoint presentations that people in the respective states out at home can be pulling up their computer. And I walked them through a set of slides about what's going on around the country with the state fiscal situation. So in my 10 to 15 minutes of the program, there were 3 of us as presenters. I talked about what is the size of state budget gaps around the country, you know, which states have gaps in excess of 10% of their general fund budgets, what are happening to state balances in this recession. And for instance, we are in month 15 of the current recession, so 15 months since December of 2007. So now we are close to being the longest recession since the Great Depression of the early 1930s. So 1 more month and we'll be equal to the 2 longest recessions since the Great Depression. And then really not too far from now, we'll be in the 2nd longest recession. And what's important and interesting about that information is that state fiscal problems tend to continue anywhere from 12 months to 18 months after a recession ends. So we have quite a long road ahead of us in terms of dealing with fiscal problems and trying to get budgets balanced, which is a requirement in most states.
That's true.
Yeah.
What trends, I mean, obviously you look for trends. What trends are you seeing across the state? I can think of one that just pops up in my mind, and that's the rising cost of health care, for example.
Right.
What kind of trends do you see that all the states are struggling with or feel that we're all in the same boat?
Right. Well, you know, overwhelmingly right now, because of the state fiscal situation, states are just struggling with that. And we do try to look for trends there. In the early 1990s, states had looked more to raising taxes to try to close their budget gaps and solve their budget problems. In the last recession of the early 2000s, so just 7 or 8 years ago, states really didn't raise taxes. They raised some fees, but mostly states were looking to cut spending to deal with their problems. This time around, we have seen states really cutting back on spending. They have really cut their budgets. A state like Florida has had 4 consecutive budget cuts. They're actually looking at a budget that's lower than the budget they've had a couple of years ago. But now, as we get deeper into this recession and the effects of those budget cuts really start hitting services and programs, there are an increasing number of states looking to raise revenues, which is somewhat interesting to me because we've been in a more conservative fiscal environment in the last decade or 2. And so we're now seeing states saying, gosh, you know, these cuts are pretty deep, they're pretty penetrating, we're going to need to find some additional revenues to try to shore up budgets. We're mostly seeing fee increases. So if you own a vehicle in a lot of states, you're going to be paying more to register that vehicle for license plates. We're seeing a lot of fishing licenses and court fees, those kinds of things being raised. And some states are starting to talk about some of the bigger taxes. In California, for instance, they've looked at and have enacted a temporary personal income tax surcharge. So we're seeing some of that. But that does really relate then to what's happening in these various policy areas like healthcare. So there's been a lot of concern about the rising cost of healthcare. And some states have made some great efforts. Massachusetts, for instance, has done some universal type healthcare, very expensive, but they're making some inroads there. So that's been an area, the whole healthcare issue for sure. But also, there's been this growing concern about higher education, because higher education tends to get cut more than other programs during economic downturns. Then when state revenues start to recover, states do try to increase funding for higher education, so they tend to get higher than average increases when the economy improves. But right now we've seen at least 1, 2, for some states 3 years of fiscal problems, and so higher education has been cut pretty dramatically. And we're seeing numbers coming out of states like Connecticut, for instance, where they're saying the budget cut is so severe in Connecticut for higher education that they will either have to lay off 335 professors, close one of their schools completely, or take some other drastic measures like increasing tuition by 25%. So there's this sort of domino effect, if you will, when states start cutting their budgets, because these various programs inevitably get hit by the budget cuts, and then services and programs for citizens are affected.
Well, it brings up two things for me. One is inflation, which I'd like to talk about, but I think the other one is to be competitive in a global economy, we have to have very well-educated, our youth has to be competitive. So what's the trend on education? I mean, I think, you know, for a while I've seen the what they call the P through 20, which is preschool through 20-year-old, because you need that continuum, you know, you have to have the school readiness in preschool, early childhood education, to get into public school. But then at some point, you have to help the child know what path they're going to take. So the thought of the school within a school, or school academies, or charter schools, or whatever, so that at some point in time, let's say they're 15 or 16, they kind of know a little bit more where their path leads to. And then so that you get them going that continuum out of high school into what? Do they do vocational schools? Do they do community college, get certificates? Do they go to higher ed? And so, you know, what's the trend there? I mean, it's kind of disturbing when you say, you know, we're cutting higher ed because it's just, you know, it's not maybe the core service, whatever the core service is. And for us, it may be, you know, at least decent roads to drive on, decent health care to take care of us. But maybe our higher ed, maybe you have to put off. But the question is, can we put it off when in reality, we need those students to help with our economy? So, you know, what do you see in it?
It's an excellent point. And in fact, David Weiss is the chief economist at Standard & Poor's, and David is a frequent speaker at NCSL meetings. And he has some fascinating and frightening statistics about what's happening to higher education in the United States. And he points out that we are losing ground to other developing countries. And in fact, one of the trends that occurs is that these other nations send their high school graduates to the United States for a superior higher education experience, and then they go back home. And so it's sort of an interesting kind of brain drain. So these children, these young adults are being educated in this country, and they go back to their home countries, and we don't have those mathematic majors and those science majors and those engineering majors staying here. They're actually going back to their home countries. He points out that it is somewhat short-sighted to be cutting higher education at a time when the United States is losing its predominance as, you know, the leader in R&D and you know, research and development in other areas. In terms of, you know, why this happens is that in times of economic downturns, when state lawmakers are struggling with these endless demands and finite resources, they sometimes will look to higher education because they see that it has another source of funding, and that is tuition and fees paid by students and their parents. And so you will see tuition increases during these kinds of economic times. At the same time, a lot of states will try to increase their needs-based student aid so that the neediest of these kids going to college have some additional support to get them through college. In terms of the sort of preschool through high school, P through 12, if we talk about it in that context, we typically see that during economic downturns, states really try to preserve funding for K-12 education. It's a real effort. In this past couple of years before we hit the current downturn, there were an increasing number of states trying to provide full-day kindergarten, moving from half-day to full-day, trying to provide some pre-K services to kids. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of those initiatives sort of stalled in this environment. They're just expensive, and you know, you sort of have to do some core functions, whatever each state decides those core functions are. And what's unfortunate about the current economic downturn is states actually are cutting per pupil student aid in some cases. Florida, for instance, had a pretty big cut to K-12 education, and I think the reduction is $144 per student is actually being cut out of the formula. And they're not alone in that regard. And what you'll hear from a number of states, the Senate President in Kansas recently said, you have to consider, when you have budget problems of the magnitude the states are currently facing, you can't leave K-12 education and healthcare off the table. They have to be on the table with everything else that the state funds and provides, because they represent between half and 2/3 of the entire state budget. So you have to consider all of them, and the situation is so severe right now, everything really is on the table.
Whew. Well, let's not talk gloom and doom.
Okay. Sorry.
Let's talk about hope here. And actually, I'm sure there's the bright side to this, and that's innovation, it's opportunities, it's to ask, why do we do what we do? Why have we done it this way for so long? I would think, I mean, given that you get to see the global, kind of the global picture with all the states, that you must be seeing some pretty exciting and pretty